Is homelessness a crime in the United States? The country's highest court makes a ruling that could impact hundreds of thousands of people who live on the streets. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. The U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that local and state governments can now ticket or arrest those who are sleeping or camping in public places, such as sidewalks, streets, parks, and even broken-down vehicles. The move comes as major cities across the nation are experiencing a spike in homeless encampments. While some city officials say the ruling will give them time to enforce measures to keep public spaces clean and safe, others believe criminalizing the homeless can only make things worse. Our correspondent, Ediz Tiyansan, reports from Los Angeles.
For years, unhoused residents of Grants Pass, a city in southern Oregon, received citations for camping in public, $300 fines, and even trespassing charges, punishable by up to 30 days in jail.
We're out here struggling, and there's no place for us, like, literally. It's like we're made to move every 5 days, and if we don't, we get ticketed, kicked out of the park, and arrested, and it's ridiculous.
In a plaintiff lawsuit, a group of homeless people allege that the city deprives them of a place to sleep and violates the 8th Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The city claims encampments have reached the point of threatening public security.
Urinating, defecating in public, also a human need. But we've never really seriously suggested that unless and until the government provides you a reasonably convenient place to go to the bathroom, that you then have the right to go to the bathroom on public property.
The controversial court case had led to weeks of protests outside the U.S. Supreme Court, which ultimately sided with the city in a landmark decision that could have sweeping implications across the country. The ruling reveals a shift in the position of the Supreme Court, which had previously refused to even hear a case years ago, and thereby upholding a decision by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which until now prevented the criminal punishment of anyone for sleeping outside in the absence of an alternative like affordable housing or shelters. But now, with its conservative majority, the U.S. Supreme Court has set a new precedent that could increase the authority local governments have in dealing with their unhoused residents.
Their lives are very difficult, and it will make them more difficult, but will also give people new criminal records. It's going to make it harder for them to find work and to find housing and escape homelessness. If we go down this line, this road of criminalizing people and banishing them, we're going to wake up 2 or 3 years down the road and we're going to have twice as many homeless people as we have now.
In Los Angeles, already dubbed as the nation's homeless capital with its mild climate, officials are worried about the possibility of an increase of homeless people to the area from other states, while activists anywhere are worried about what appears to be a paradigm shift at the U.S. Supreme Court. Ediz Tiyansan, CGTN, Los Angeles.
To discuss the homeless crisis, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Los Angeles, Mark Horvath is the CEO of Invisible People. Here in Washington, D.C., Jacquie Luqman is coordinator for the Black Alliance for Peace, D.C. From Maryland, we're joined by Joseph Williams. He is a former senior editor at U.S. News and World Report. And from Ohio, we're joined by Donald Whitehead, Jr. He is the co-founder of Racial Equity Partners and the executive director of the National Coalition for the Homeless. Welcome to all of you. Donald, let me start with you. You have been homeless yourself, but now you advocate for people who are homeless. You've been doing that for many, many years. What do you make of this Supreme Court decision, which effectively criminalizes being homeless?
I think that it was a terribly misguided decision and ignored precedent. It ignored many amicus briefs that really underline the structural issues that are involved in homelessness. It'll only exacerbate homelessness for the individuals who are affected. I think that Martin versus Boise was very reasonable. If you don't have enough shelter in a community, it does not make sense from a financial perspective. It's actually a lot more expensive for people to be criminalized, jailed, fined, or ticketed than it does for people to be able to be provided adequate, safe, affordable housing. We know this doesn't work, and the Supreme Court really ignored a lot of information to the contrary. Communities don't have to do this. Just because the Supreme Court made this decision, it does not mean communities have to do it. We are very hopeful that communities will take the compassionate stance and not involve themselves in this practice of criminalization, which really is a practice of making people invisible, making sure that people don't see the impact of the structural issues that got people there in the first place.
Mark, you are in Los Angeles, and as we heard from our reporter in Los Angeles, it has one of the biggest homeless populations in the country. You've also experienced homelessness yourself. So what is your view on this? What kind of impact do you think this is going to have on people who are homeless right now?
Well, we have to make something perfectly clear. The impact is going to be on all of us, not just homeless people. For every $100 increase in median rent, homelessness increases by 9%. So arresting homeless people, as the lawyer said in the video roll-in that you did towards the end, when a person gets out of jail, they're still homeless, but now they have a criminal record. So criminalization of homelessness has been around for a long, long time. The Supreme Court just gave the green light for other cities to start criminalizing, and for those that are criminalizing homelessness, like in Los Angeles, we have 4118, which is criminalizing homelessness, and has been proven, literally data shows that it just makes homelessness worse. So you're out there, you're the public, you don't want to see homeless encampments. Criminalizing homelessness, criminalizing poverty is just going to make those encampments grow. If you do not want to see homeless people, I don't want to see homeless people outside. I think everybody agrees with that. Then we need to support real solutions that will prevent and solve homelessness.
Mark, you raised an important issue there, and that is when you pointed out that for every $100 increase in rent, homelessness increases by 9%. So it would appear that this is a challenge that can't be just met by the provision of shelters for people. It has to be tackled in a wider way, where there is some kind of control over the increases in rents, and we're seeing that in cities all across the United States.
It's just getting so bad, and it will continue to get bad. We first have to prevent homelessness, and then for those that are outside, we have to get them the help they need. If it's somebody like me who is out on the streets of Hollywood and I was able to restabilize my life, we have to help that direction. But if it's somebody that is just outside, whether it's mental illness, whether it's addiction, maybe they've been out there far too long, maybe they are just a senior. Ageism is real. Nobody's going to hire them. For people like that, we need to get them into housing with the support services they need. I mean, otherwise, homelessness is going to continue to grow.
Jacquie Luqman, it would also appear that homelessness is skewed by race. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development released its annual 2023 report on homelessness, and it said, and I'm quoting here, people who identify as Black, African American, as well as indigenous people continue to be overrepresented among the populations experiencing homelessness, unquote. The figures also show massive increases in the number of homeless people for Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans. Black people make up 1/3 of those who are homeless. Why are we seeing increases among these groups of people?
Because it's the built-in inequality, racialized inequality in the economic and the social fabric of this country. Surely poverty affects everybody, right? But in a white supremacist, settler colonial, capitalist, patriarchal country that is the United States, that has been built on oppressing people who are not of the majority population, and profits are made from the oppression of those other people. There always has to be a lower class to be exploited in a capitalist system. And then you add on the racial history or the history of racism in this country, and it's really hard not to see that the same groups of people are still being oppressed today, even though certain people in this country say, oh, you know, the slavery happened so long ago, the discrimination against immigrants happened so long ago. It's not like that now. We're a better society. We're a more perfect union. Everybody has opportunity. Well, we see that that is not true. Just by virtue of the fact that we have such an enormous homelessness problem, because the problem is not with the homeless people. It is the fact that people don't have homes in one of the richest countries this planet may have ever seen. So the fact that there are so many Black, brown, indigenous people among the homeless population, when we are only 10, 13 as far as indigenous people, even less percentage of the population, but we're overrepresented among homeless populations, that speaks to the fact that there are some people who are still denied economic and social opportunity in this country, and it is absolutely based on racialized discrimination. And then those people are now going to be turned around and criminalized for being oppressed and discriminated against into this manufactured situation of perpetual poverty. That's what we are facing here. And the Supreme Court, like every other institution in this country, won't deal with the things that cause homelessness, but they want to criminalize the victims of it.
Joseph, you know, as Donald pointed out at the beginning of the show, the court decision gives local and state governments the legal authority now to regulate homelessness. That led to a Seattle University law professor and director of the Homeless Rights Advocacy Project to say this. She says, this case was about whether you can punish people for the unavoidable consequences of being human. The Supreme Court of the United States said yes. I mean, what do you make of that decision by the court?
It tacks. It's part of the trend line where we have a very conservative court, a 6-3 supermajority, that's willing to go along with decisions that benefit businesses, that benefit corporations, that benefit landholders. I, for one, was not surprised. I mean, even the fact that they took the case, which had been adjudicated on the lower courts, even the fact that the Supreme Court took the case indicated to me that they were probably going to rule in a certain way, because the Supreme Court gets to pick and choose what cases that it takes, and it takes less than 10% of all the cases that are appealed to it. And I think the bigger picture here is the fact that we've got a very conservative government that is just chipping away at the rights of the individual, that's chipping away at the safety net, and you have a lot of people who are falling through the cracks and falling on the streets as a result of that. And there's not a lot of political will to really tackle the situation and get our arms around it, because not only do you have rising housing prices, and neither candidate in the 2024 presidential race has explicitly talked about what they would do about housing as part of their stump speech, but there's no congressional legislation. And on the local level, you need more housing, but a lot of the housing is built for people who can't afford it, and people who don't like homelessness don't want a homeless shelter in their zip code. So you've got a conflagration of problems. The Supreme Court just kind of put a legal cherry on top of a really nasty sundae here, and I, for one, was not surprised that they did it.
Donald, I'm going to get back to something that we talked about a moment ago, and that is the sort of vicious cycle of despair that we see. As Mark pointed out, you know, people are arrested for being homeless. Some of them may end up in prison. They may serve time. They can serve up to 30 days. Once they come out of prison, then they have a criminal record. Then they cannot get a job because of that criminal record. They have all these difficulties that they have to experience at that time. It makes the situation far worse, doesn't it?
It absolutely makes the situation worse, and often some of those individuals are individuals with behavioral health issues as well. Right. You know, the Los Angeles jail is the largest correctional facility in the country, the largest mental health facility in the country. So we know that this revolving cycle, and even if they aren't arrested, they're given these fines that are impossible for them to meet the demands of. But I will say that we were already seeing a increase in criminalization. I think it ties back to your other guest who talked about the racial inequities and structural racism in this country. As we see more people of color entering into the homeless system, we see more of this kind of criminalization. So we've moved from compassion to contempt and criminalization. And one of the things that I'll also say about this particular issue, we've already seen some of the most draconian criminalization practices prior to the decision. So what we see after this, I can only imagine at this point. So in Tennessee, it's a felony with up to 6 years in jail if you're homeless on public property in that state. Kentucky just introduced a law that makes it legal to use force, up to and including deadly force, similar to the stand your ground laws in Florida, against homeless people. So we were already seeing a trend of unbelievable consequences for people that are homeless. And back to what Mark said, none of this solves homelessness. It is an expensive way to make homelessness worse, is what it is. And we all thought that this might happen. This shouldn't have never even made it to the Supreme Court because it was actually upheld in the appellate court. So no surprise, but we do have a lot of fear about the outcome. But I will say, we shouldn't throw our hands up in the air. Most of these decisions are made at a local level. So you don't have to worry about the presidential race to keep criminalization out of your community. You have to vote in your local race for your mayor, for your sheriff, for the governor. Those are where these decisions are being made, and we can all be involved in that process in our communities.
Right, Mark, that's one point where local officials can be voted in, officials that are sympathetic to the plight of the homeless. But are there any laws on the books right now that actually protect people who are homeless?
Well, I first want to say what a wonderful panel. You brought up racism, and Joseph said a couple of things about how we have this movement, this conservative movement that is taking rights away, women's rights, LGBT rights, civil rights, homeless people's rights. And it's a scary time, but that means we just have to get loud. We have to get louder. I wish we wouldn't, but I think something else Joseph said, we lack the public and political will to influence change, to fix the affordable housing crisis, to provide a living wage, to really solve the social crises that we're facing in America. And there are real solutions. Hennepin County, which is Minneapolis, is reducing homelessness by a community-wide solution. It's not just housing, it's not just shelters, it's not just prevention, it's all of us. They're investing in affordable housing, in eviction prevention, shelters, and then housing with supportive services.
Right. Mark, before we move on, I just want to get some info from you on a documentary that you made. You made a documentary on the fate of the homeless, did you?
Yeah, I've been producing video content since 2008. We've done many documentaries. In fact, we have one on Hennepin County coming out. But I was in Grants Pass a couple of times. It's a very powerful couple of videos. One thing Grants Pass does that I've never seen before, and I went back about 3 weeks ago to be with a volunteer team that helps people that are disabled that are not able to move. So what the city of Grants Pass has done, I call it musical parks. So they move people from park to park to park. So every 3 days, 5 days, they have to move. And if you're disabled, you can't move. So thank God for these volunteers that go do this, but the whole thing is psychological warfare.
Right.
What the city of Grants Pass is doing is trying to get people to move to another community, homeless people to another community, and then that community is going to criminalize and push homeless people to your community, which is why we have to really start speaking up for real solutions.
Jacquie, earlier this month, the country, the United States, commemorated the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Movement, and we look at the Fair Housing Act that was passed in 1968. That was almost 60 years ago. Despite that, housing still remains a major challenge. What has gone wrong in those 60 years?
Capitalism. And capitalism hasn't gone wrong. Capitalism does exactly what capitalism does. It commodifies everything. You know, the United Nations established housing as a human right, and I think almost every other country in the world has signed off on that UN Charter declaring the human rights of people being housing, education, healthcare, a clean environment. But these are things that are not recognized as human rights that all citizens deserve to have in this country and in most capitalist countries, because the private market, private industry, real estate developers, investors have privatized the housing market. It has always been privatized in this country, so housing is not a human right for people. You can have housing if you can afford it. And the minute you can no longer afford your housing, then no one seems to be concerned that you can't afford a place to live. So that's what happened to housing and the Fair Housing Act and the gains from the Civil Rights Act that we have won. Capitalism was allowed to do what capitalism does.
Yeah.
And that legislation was enacted in a capitalist system that does not uphold the values of human life and human rights in the way that that legislation and that movement for human rights was intended for that legislation to work.
Joseph Williams, you know, as we've heard several times, the responsibility would now seem to be at the local level. It comes down to towns and cities across the country. The United States Conference of Mayors, they held a meeting here in Washington, D.C. this past May. Many of them recognize that homelessness is a serious problem. In fact, they said that it's the biggest crisis the nation faces right now. But there wasn't any kind of well thought out, considered policy on how to meet this challenge. So what is the way out of this crisis?
The way out is by doing the opposite of what the mayors did, and that's treating it like an afterthought. Now, look, admittedly, and this may be the one discouraging word, that mayors have a very difficult problem to solve. On the one hand, yes, it is a detriment to downtown to have people sleeping out of doors. It is a knock on the richest country in the world to have people sleeping outdoors. Right. And it does provide for some safety challenges and some public health challenges. But the problem is that in order to get a affordable housing, they have to be creative. They have to come up with a lot of solutions, and there's not a lot of money set aside for this kind of problem, especially when you have schools that are falling apart, when you have police that are down a lot of recruits, when you have tax bases that don't want to be increased. It leads to this shortfall that not a lot of mayors are willing to do what needs to get done to create the revenue to try to build more affordable housing. I mean, as Jacquie was saying, capitalism very much is part of the issue here, because it's easier to build housing and have some set asides for market rate housing and set aside for low income housing and the subsidized housing that you're giving is still less affordable than sleeping in a park because people don't have the jobs. The thing is that it has to be a unified solution. As I think as Mark was saying, he was saying that the way they're approaching it in Hennepin County is very on point. You have to have support services created as a community initiative and have buy-in where everyone in the community has skin in the game and there's not a lot of NIMBYism, or at least it's kept to a minimum.
Right. Donald, what about action at the federal level? I mean, we've heard several times on the show now that this is an extremely rich country, the richest in the world. It has the largest economy in the world. But then, you know, it raises questions about the government spending priorities. And the government recognizes that homelessness is a problem, but there's no money allocated to solve that problem. I mean, there is money allocated for lots of wars around the world, as we see, but not for homelessness. How does that change?
Well, it changes when people start to raise their voices and share with their elected officials that this is what they want. Research was done by some of the national agencies on the public's perception of homelessness, and the public, 72%, don't believe that criminalization is the right pattern. They believe that people should be afforded housing. Maybe some of them don't believe as much as we do in some of the different models of housing, but people do believe in housing. And so people have to get to the poll. They have to call their elected officials. They have to visit their elected officials and make sure they know, because we came very, very close, not to the ultimate solution, but a dramatic increase in housing production through the Build Back Better plan. We came one vote short of that. So that, to me, says that if we are committed, if we are organized, if we get to elected officials, we can change enough votes to be able to make sure that the thing that we've never had is housing to the scale of the issue of homelessness. That's never happened. The only thing we've done in this country is we've provided emergency responses. And the same emergency response that we helped pass in 1987 is still the primary source of funding for homelessness. So, you know, we haven't come very far. There's a couple of things in the population growth that may move people in a different direction. So the largest growing sector of the population are seniors. They're individuals over 55 years of age. The largest portion of people who sleep outside on the ground, they sleep in abandoned.
Okay, Donald, I'm sorry to interrupt you there.
People over 55.
Right. I'm sorry to do that, but we have run out of time. Thank you to all of you for being on the show. We need to leave it there. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.